We're a healthcare consulting firm in Baltimore. We have 40 consultants. About 70% of the practice is healthcare services, so physician practices, hospitals, payers, providers. About 15–20% is health IT, electronic medical records, mobile health. How does that interact with delivery of care? The Affordable Care Act, what are the penalties? What are the benefits? And then my aspect is the medtech aspect. So regulatory strategy, reimbursement strategy, how do you get through FDA? We can do economic modeling. How does your product interact with big data or databases, electronic medical record systems, and the delivery of care? We also have a full healthcare marketing service. So what I wanted to talk today was an integrated approach to developing your product. Frequently, companies that are developing medical products, they have a utility, a central utility, and their goal, of course, is to come on the market and make profit, but they haven't given a lot of thought to all the steps in between developing the product itself and how they're going to get to market and how they're going to get paid. So this is a cartoon that kind of shows the problem in a funny way. There's a group of children, and the underpants gnomes are small little gnomes that have been going around and stealing underpants, and the children find them, track them to their lair, and ask them why they're doing this, and this is the explanation that they get. So I hope you can all hear this okay. It's not.
I don't get it. You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit. I get it. No, you don't.
So that's the central problem and the central question. So how do you get from collecting underpants to profit? And the way to do that is to embrace all these stakeholders and think very strategically at the beginning. So you have to think about what is the value proposition of your product. Who are the key opinion leaders? What are their opinions on this? What do they need to see? How do you get physicians to accept your product? How are you going to get paid? How will you get cash flow into your product so that you can develop your R&D and also distribute it? Have you thought about the regulatory process through the CE mark in Europe or through the FDA? Have you thought about design and manufacturing? You have to develop that. You have to tailor the engineering of your product to the market. What do investors want to see? So all of these different aspects you need to be conscious of from the beginning to develop a coherent strategy. So ultimately, this all starts with who is your customer? Is it patients? Are you going to go direct to consumers? That's desirable because there may be a retail component. You're not dealing with insurers. There may be a low regulatory bar. How about providers? Are they your main customer? So what does a physician want to see? Is there good science? How does it fit into his workflow? How is he going to use it? What about the hospitals? Are they going to purchase your product? Are you competing as a commodity against other similar products or other therapies which may be cheaper, or there may be more of an ingrained desire to use those products? How about private payers or CMS? So private payers, are they going to cover you? Are they going to support your product? Does it fit their needs? Again, are you competing as a commodity? CMS can be national or local. Remember, they only cover patients 65 years and older. So is that relevant to your strategy? Are you developing your product for a co-development partner? Is your goal to integrate with a product from a Medtronic or a St. Jude? Have you considered what they need to see and develop the proper evidence? Is your goal something for industry? Is it a tool for them to make their products? Non-government organizations is another possible customer. In the end, everything comes down to the data that you generate, and that can be engineering data, it can be animal, it can be clinical. You have to develop proper data to demonstrate your value, and then and only then can you hope to acquire reimbursement. So as you think about the different hurdles along the way, you think about the addressable markets. What are the regulatory burdens? How will you get paid? The main two barriers here are regulatory FDA and CMS payers for reimbursement, and the bars that they consider and what they need to see to make a decision is very different. The FDA needs to see, are you safe and effective? Do you do what you say you do in your indication statement and do it safely and effectively? So everything, again, stems from that indication statement. And there's the easy way denoted in bold, and the hard way let is narrow. So if there is a clear path, 510K, which we'll talk about, or PMA, which we'll talk about, the pathway can be quite clear. It may be a little bit more difficult if you are novel, so a de novo 510K, and we'll talk about that, or an HDE is another pathway. On the reimbursement side, payers need to start with, you have to be through the FDA and on the market. So they assume that you are safe and effective for what you have done on your, for what you've claimed on your label, but are you reasonable and necessary? So they are considering, are you cost effective? Do you meet their needs? How do you compare against similar therapies or different therapies? You may be a device competing against physical therapy or a drug. So that is what they consider. So again, if you're similar to something that's out there, if there's already a code, if you're already bundled in, things are very easy to reimbursement, although your reimbursement may not be adequate, and we'll learn about that from Julie next. If you are different, the pathway, again, can be quite challenging, and we'll learn about that in a second. So as you consider the addressable market, you need to consider it in this way. So you need to ultimately think about every potential use case and every potential market. The balls here show market size. So if you think about reimbursement going from left to right with more reimbursement or easier reimbursement to the right, and regulatory on the y-axis with the burden getting higher as you go up, you see on the bottom right the largest addressable market that also has easiest and best reimbursement and the lowest regulatory burden. That would be ideal. These products rarely exist. The worst case would be the smaller ball in the upper left, which is the smallest addressable market and the highest regulatory burden and the most difficult reimbursement. Typically what you'll find is that you're somewhere in between. So the second ball on the left is kind of a moderate size market, a moderate regulatory burden, and reimbursement is a little bit more difficult. The fourth ball to the right, a little bit slightly higher market size, better reimbursement, slightly lower regulatory bar, that would be more desirable. Even more desirable would be the larger, potentially more desirable would be the larger market denoted by the one in the middle. However, the regulatory burden is a little higher and the reimbursement is lower. So you have to decide, ultimately, what is your utilization, what is your value proposition, and then you need to design appropriately. And the goal all along is to make marketing claims that will get you to those markets, and that comes from the label, and that comes from the FDA. Your indications for use, everything follows from that, and you have to tailor your evidence development to demonstrate this to the FDA. So all safety and effectiveness comes from that. And the bigger picture, the bottom bullet, your reimbursement and marketing comes from the indications you seek and the regulatory pathway. You need to think about all these things we've already talked about. Who's your customer? How are you going to get paid? And what evidence do you need? So now we're going to focus in on the FDA itself and what is that process through the FDA. You'll hear more on reimbursement from Julie after me. So there's 6 centers at the FDA. CDER is drugs, CBER is biologics, anything that comes from a tissue source. CIFSAN is food products and cosmetics. CDM is veterinary medicine. CDRH is all devices. CTP is tobacco. So what does regulation involve? The FDA does not do the testing. They review the testing that you do. You submit that to them. They approve clinical studies for to be done in the United States. They will also give you opinions on clinical studies you may be doing elsewhere in the world. If you want to come to market in the United States, they will give you feedback whether the data you collect at the end of your trial would be adequate for their purposes. They inspect manufacturing facilities around the world for products that are going to be sold in the United States. They work with companies to monitor products post-approval, so after the products are already out. They regulate importing, exporting, they do research, and they do education as well. So I'm going to focus on device regulation today. The companies that we see from Israel through the Maryland Israel Development Center, 95% of the time they are devices or diagnostics. Occasionally we see some biologics or therapeutics, but that tends to be rare. So I thought today I would focus in on the on the device side. Devices are regulated on a risk-based paradigm. You wouldn't regulate a scalpel the same way you would think about a ventricular assist device. So it's broken down by risk. So class 1 is the lowest risk devices. These are examples would be tongue depressor or a scalpel. Most of these are exempt from pre-market review, which means they are not reviewed by the FDA. You merely submit them. It's like filling out your tax return. You fill out a bunch of paperwork. You state that you are using good manufacturing practices. You're labeling according to guidelines. You set the name of your company and the name of your device, and you're off and running. That's Class 1. Class 2 is more complex, higher risk. These could be more complex surgical instruments. In the vascular space, this could be a balloon, an angioplasty balloon. It could be an atherectomy device. It could be a coronary wire for doing angioplasty. Most of these are not exempt, meaning they're reviewed by the FDA. And for Class 2s, that's done by a 510K, and we'll talk about what that is. Class 3 devices, the highest risk. These would be things like defibrillators, ventricular assist devices. These are life-sustaining devices. For this, you have to do the full data set, so full animal, engineering, and clinical, and that's a submission is called a PMA. So what are the submission types? A pre-submission is something I would really like to hit home today. It's essentially free consulting from the FDA. So you bundle up all of your materials, and it can be very early. It could be conception stage, maybe even just a patent filing report. It could be something as significant as a full clinical trial protocol, and they will review it. It could be a clinical trial protocol for somewhere else in the world besides the United States. It could be your PMA that you're ready to submit. In focal sections, you want to ask questions, and the main benefit is you ask specific questions, and they will give you specific feedback. So whatever type of questions you have, they will bring those experts into the process. So it could be engineers, chemists, veterinarians, statisticians, physicians, and at the end of the day, they will ask your questions. So this is something that you can submit yourself, but remember, just like computers, garbage in, garbage out. It's very important that you ask the right questions to get the proper answers so that you can get the feedback to guide you as you develop your project. The deadline on this, it's a 60-day review cycle. So if you turn something in today, in 60 days you'll have written feedback and or a face or telephone meeting. I would encourage you to take either a face-to-face or telephone meeting because you can have more back and forth and get your answers. It's really critical to work with experts that can help you ask the proper questions so you get the most out of it. A 510K, this is how you get your Class 2 device cleared and on the market. And you have to show something called substantial equivalence. So you find another device that has already been cleared through 510K. That becomes what's called your predicate device. And you show that you are substantially equivalent, which means you're either better, equal, or worse by a small margin that is not significant. To prove that, you would have to do at the very minimal engineering, depending on the risk, and there is a whole spectrum of risk for these Class 2 devices from the lower risk to the highest risk. You would need to do engineering, plus minus maybe animal, plus minus maybe clinical studies. About 10 to 15% require clinical studies, but all require some performance testing. The turnaround on this, the review time is 90 days. So what that means, if you submit it today, the clock starts for FDA. If they then write you back and say, here are some questions we need you to answer, the FDA clock stops. It restarts when you resubmit the answers to those questions, and in 90 FDA days, you'll have your decision, thumbs up or thumbs down. This is the pathway that you go through. The goal, this is off the FDA guidance that was updated in 2014, and you can download that, or if you reach out to me, I will email that to you. You can see the goal is to get to the red circles on the bottom, SE, substantial equivalence. And this is the pathway. So decision 1, is your predicate device legally marketed? If the answer is yes, you keep going. Do the devices have the same intended use? Remember, intended use is your indications for use. Everything stems for this. If the answer is yes, you keep going. Are the devices technologically the same? If the answer is yes, you're equivalent. You're done. If the answer is no, you go up to the top, decision number 4. Do the technological differences have a different question of safety and effectiveness? This is critical. If you can say that it does not, you keep going. If you do, you're non-substantially equivalent. That does not mean game over and you can't come to market. It means if you're still Class 2, you may be kicked out to the de novo pathway, which is where you're starting your own pathway, and everybody after you that is like you has to compare to you. So If the answer is no, and you go down to decision 5A, this is where you show data. And it could be bench data, animal or clinical, where you show that you are substantially equivalent, and then hopefully you get to the bottom, substantially equivalent. Moving on to PMA, this is again the most risky of devices, the class 3s. Doesn't matter if there are 100 devices identical to yours that are PMA class 3s, you have to do the same thing that every other company did, every other device did. You have to show safety and effectiveness. You have to do full engineering, full manufacturing testing, full animal, and full clinical. If you are a first-of-a-kind or controversial device, it may go to a panel of experts. So the review time for this is 180 days if there's no panel. And remember, that's 180 FDA days, so that clock can start and stop. If there's a panel, it's 320 days. Combination products, what if your product is not a pure drug or a pure biologic or a pure device? Then you're a combination, and you are subject to the regulations of the primary function of the device. So are you primarily a device that has another component? Then you'd fall under the device laws. Are you primarily a drug? You would fall under the drug laws. This is a big point of strategy and something that's really critical. The bar on the drug and biologic side is much higher. You have to do 2 pivotal trials. The trials are much larger in terms of numbers of patients. It can be 1,000 patient studies times 2, whereas on the device side they would accept a smaller trial. So here's 2 examples. Drug-coated stent. So you're familiar with stents that go in the coronary arteries, bare metal stents. When they added a drug to them, that is now a combination product. The question is this primarily a drug or primarily a device? They decided that the main function of the product is to act as a scaffold. That's a device function, so it was regulated by the device side. And the drug was thought to be an add-on, and the drug people made comments on the drug, but it was a much easier pathway than had it been on the drug side. A drug-coated balloon is a balloon where they spray or coat the drug on. So is this a device where the dilation is the main function, or is this really a novel drug delivery way where you're wiping or painting drug onto the inside of a vessel? So the early determination was it was a drug. And so the companies then, to try and keep it as a device, had to go through really artificial, tough machinations to keep it on the device side. So, for example, if you're doing an angioplasty, your goal is to get the narrowing less than 30% narrowed at the end of your procedure. So to make it seem that the device was doing the main effect of dilating, if when you prepped it with another balloon, your first dilation, if your residual was less than 30%, you had to throw those patients out of the trial, or else you were a drug, and that would kick you into the drug regulation. So finally, the FDA made a decision and said, you know what, we think this is primarily a drug. However, because there is such expertise on the device side, we're going to label it primarily a device, and the device team wins. The company went back and added those patients back into their study and made a much better study. So this is a big part of strategy and something to consider ahead of time when you're designing your product, but also designing your clinical trial. So the whole risk paradigm, how do things get approved by FDA? It's a risk-benefit balance. Does the benefit outweigh the risk? And that is device by device and population by population and use by use. So an example, a stent, the same stent that you might put in your legs, you can also put in the bile ducts of the liver. In those patients, it's being used where there is liver cancer, and those patients have, on average, a 6-month life expectancy. So you can imagine the engineering bar is very low for these patients who are terminal anyway. However, that same exact device, if you're going to put it in the leg where patients are going to live 20 years, it's subject to different forces. Then you're worried about long-term metal fatigue. And so the testing bar is much higher. So again, companies were selling these biliary stents off-label for use in the leg, and that had to be clamped down on because the risk tolerance was much different. So there's a worksheet that will kind of clarify this process. It was published on March 28, 2012. There's a risk-benefit guidance. I would encourage you to take a look at it, and again, I can furnish you all with that data. So some examples of this kind of strategy, early on strategy, considering market size, regulatory bar, and reimbursement bar, nutraceuticals. So these are vitamins that have a health benefit. If you can make a general health claim, makes you feel better, gives you more energy, improves your general health, that's okay, that's not regulated. So for example, Vitalogic, the name of it is OsteoProtect. If you go through their marketing materials, they don't claim anything about medical claims, so nothing to the effect of reduces knee pain, nothing to the effect of builds or regenerates cartilage. Those are medical claims. If they claim that, they would then be subject to FDA regulation. Mobile Health, the Fitbit, is a pedometer. They have a huge consumer market. They are claiming general fitness. If they tried to claim decreasing heart attack risk or improving hypertension treatment or decreasing rates of strokes, those are medical claims. They would have to generate data. They would then fall under FDA regulation. The drug-coated balloon, again, we went through that. That's a balance of device or drug pathway through engineering and clinical trial design. But again, that was done to address the regulatory burden. Theranos is very interesting. That's a very famous diagnostic on a chip that is coming through. They are regulated as a laboratory-developed test, and I won't go into that, but today they don't have to go through FDA. That regulation is changing. Soon they will. If they are Class 3 tests, so high-risk tests, they will come under regulation sooner. If they are Class 2 tests, that would be 510K. They will come under regulation lower. Last time I looked on Theranos' website, they had 212 tests. Of these, only 17 were Class 3s, so they could decide if they came under regulation tomorrow, they could decide to stop marketing those, or they could start generating that data and come under compliance. So that's, again, a strategy question. I wanted to talk about two more examples of, again, this integrated approach. There are some formal and not so formal programs that you can do to do this. One is called Parallel Review. This is a great program that's going on between CMS and FDA where they are reviewing the product in parallel at the same time. Typically, CMS will not make a national coverage determination or even consider your device until the day you're cleared or approved by the FDA, and then their process takes a full year. So this way they're working together, and on the day that your product is FDA cleared or approved, instead of 1 year, it's 1 month. Two participants took part of this pilot. It was considered a pilot. One was Exact Sciences. That was a colon cancer screening. This was hailed as a great success, and they had a panel review. They were FDA approved, and then a month later they had a positive national coverage determination. So this was a great example. Medtronic's Simplicity Renal Denervation System didn't work out quite as well because the trial failed. I can tell you that the pilot is still on the books, but they're really not taking any applications right now. You can submit an application, but they're not doing it because they have limited capacity at CMS for a lot of reasons. So the overall feedback from this program, a lot of companies were in fear of CMS and FDA working together. They recognized that they needed to hear from FDA, they needed to hear from CMS, but they didn't want them talking to each other because they were afraid that both bars would go up. So that was a problem. Many companies don't want to go through the NCD as National Coverage Determination route, and Julie will speak to that in a couple minutes. Also, the pilot didn't address coding and reimbursement, so while you may have had coverage, your coding may have been not addressed or inadequate, so that's a problem. So this is something that's ongoing right now. It's called the Reimbursement Task Force. Unfortunately, I spoke to a colleague who's part of this at FDA. They're not able to publicize it for a lot of reasons. This is essentially parallel review, but you can choose to work with national CMS or a local CMS contractor or a private payer. And the idea is that you work with FDA, with your regulatory team, to figure out what is your pathway through FDA, what do you need to do. Then you pick from a menu a payer, and you bring that payer into the room, and FDA says, you know, we've seen all the data, this is what we think, they're not hiding anything, this is what we need to get through FDA. Insurance company, what do you need? And they may say, we need a different patient population, we need a different endpoint, we need a different timetable. You can then take that advice and run separate trials, or you could try and do it all in one trial. And if you do it through the FDA, first of all, your bar to get FDA approved does not change. However, you know, because you've done it through FDA, you can then put all these things on your label and you can market about these claims. So it's a great program that's going on informally. You can do this. Several firms, including our own, are trying to do this informally until it's announced formally, and this is really a great benefit. So in conclusion, I'd like to say you could think of the FDA as partners in development and use the pre-submission pathway. I would urge you to do that. Ask the right questions. Work with a good consultant who can help ask questions that are going to move you forward. Come to them early and often. Have an integrated approach. Think about your reimbursement while you're designing your product, while you're designing your clinical trials and your evidence, and FDA will help you with some of these innovative programs. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over now to Julie to talk about reimbursement, and at the end we'll have a time for questions.
All right.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Julie, do you have the presentation?
I do. Although my screen just went blank, so give me a second to see if it just pops on up here.
Okay. And in the meantime, if you do have a question, please just type your name into the chat window, and we'll be very happy to call on you for questions after Julie's presentation. Yes, we can.
Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So good
Yes,
morning,
that's good.
good afternoon. Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Cass. I won't go over my background as Jen did such a good job, but I do work with manufacturers and helping them get codes and figuring out coverage and reimbursement, and even more so how to market their products in the U.S. market with all of the regulatory environment there is. So we're going to just, at a very high level, talk about what that entails this morning. So what we've got is we're going to talk about coding and coverage and reimbursement. So as Steve was talking a lot about the FDA, he mentioned these things also. And the reason is because you really need an integrated approach. I know that lots of folks focus on FDA and FDA approval first because that is really truly a large hurdle, but it's really just the beginning. It's not the end of the process. Something that's FDA approved but can't get covered isn't going to be worth much to you if Medicare or the other payers won't cover it. And you'll notice today that I talk a lot about Medicare and CMS. The reason is in the United States, while some payers may break out, especially large payers like Blue Cross and Blue Shield who have their own technology councils, most payers still follow CMS and the Medicare guidance on what is covered and what isn't. So you can get differentiation, not saying that it never happens, but oftentimes the payers will follow what Medicare and CMS are doing. So again, the FDA approval process is the beginning, not the end. And so when you're thinking about things like your clinical trials, et cetera, as we'll talk, you want to think about how does that mesh with what I will need to show CMS in order to get my product covered and some good reimbursement. So in order to get coverage under CMS, it's got to be the product you have has to be reasonable and medically necessary for the Medicare population. And as Steve said, that's 65 and over. And then what they're really looking for, which is a change and a shift in thinking for CMS over the last 5 years or more, is what's the value proposition? Sure, this is new technology, but is it better? Does it do something different, or is it just a new mousetrap that does the same thing? And is it going to save the healthcare system money? And so that is what they look at now. Okay, I'm going to try and switch. My slide is not switching. Okay, there we go. So as I said, there's 3 steps. You need a code, you need coverage, and you need dollars. So we'll talking about the code for a minute. You don't always need a new code, and our next slide will talk about that. It's possible that there's a code already out there even though you have new technology. Coverage, we're going to talk about the different ways you can get covered. You can get covered locally by Medicare contractors, you can get covered by individual payers, or you can get a national coverage decision for Medicare population all at once. And then, of course, the dollars, once you get covered and you get a code, the question is, will you get enough reimbursement from the payers to make it worthwhile for people to buy your product? Okay, so a quick coding slide. Most of what we're going to talk about is new technology. So coding is not done by CMS or the Medicare program. It's actually done by the AMA through its CPT panel. And codes are not codes for specific products generally. So for example, there will be a code for a brace, you know, and it will be fairly generic, knee brace or wrist brace, or if it has certain characteristics, it may talk about that, but generally speaking, it won't say XYZ manufacturer brace. And so we've got those issues in terms of coding. So if you've got a new technology, but let's say it's a new way to do an ultrasound, but at base it's an ultrasound, it may be that you can use the ultrasound code. And then what you're going to look at is, okay, here's the ultrasound code. What is this ultrasound code covered by Medicare? And what does that ultrasound code pay? And if it's got a pretty good pay rate, you might, and it's got good coverage, you may say, okay, I want to make sure that I fit in that code. But if you say, gosh, Medicare doesn't cover this code, or if you say Medicare covers it, but it's a pretty low rate, then can you distinguish yourself such that you would need a new code? So that's what you're looking for. You may want the old code. There may be a code you fit, but you still want your new code. Those are the kinds of questions that you'll be asking in order to figure that out. So for coverage, so moving from coding to coverage, Steve talked a lot about the FDA. You need FDA approval, or you need devices that are cleared for use in clinical trials. As I said, our Medicare Act is called the Social Security Act. It has to be reasonable and necessary. Medicare won't pay for items and services that aren't reasonable and necessary, and this is the important part, for the diagnosis or treatment of illness or injury, or to improve the functioning of a malformed body member. And so that really limits, but not in a huge way, what Medicare will cover. So to give you a couple of examples, what do we mean by reasonable and necessary for medical necessity purposes? That's what this all boils down to. We could look at orthopedic shoes. So orthopedic shoes for folks that have diabetes are often covered. But if you want sneakers that improve your balance, maybe they'll be covered, maybe they won't be. Were they FDA approved? Do they have a medical reason? Maybe there's a condition for which they're medically necessary, that the balance is important, it's super special, maybe that's covered, a harder sell there. And then you've got perhaps sneakers that assist in preventing your injuries to knees. So they sell them in such a way that it looks like you'll have less knee injuries because of the way the padding is, just making that up. In that case, that's probably not going to be medically necessary because it's not treating an illness or injury, and it's not improving a malformed body member, it's preventive. And maybe it is and maybe it isn't. So those are the kinds of things you think about when you look at medical necessity in terms of, will Medicare cover this? And there are certain things that are statutorily non-covered. Cosmetic surgery, I say most eyeglasses. This is another case where if you just need eyeglasses, even though that will help your eyes, Medicare statutorily doesn't cover them. Although if you had cataract surgery, you're entitled to one pair of eyeglasses. So what you will find overall in the Medicare system is a lot of rules and then a lot of exceptions to the rules. So, and a lot of sub-regulatory guidance such that, you know, it's useful to have someone that can guide you through the process so that you're understanding not just what the words say, but how CMS interprets them. I don't know why my slide. All right. How do you get coverage? So we're still continuing on the topic of coverage. There's national coverage decisions and local coverage decisions. So coverage decisions that are made by CMS in Baltimore at the national level are called national coverage determinations. And then throughout the country, there are regions, each who have a contractor, and contractors can make their own local coverage determinations. And when a local coverage determination is made, they determine whether they'll cover it and how much they're going to pay. And the coverage determinations by local contractors can vary. They do not have to be consistent with one another. In any case, you're going to need to have clinical data showing the effectiveness in improving the health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries in order to get coverage, period. So again, integrated approach, you want to think about how are you going to show effectiveness and clinical data, and specifically the Medicare population, when you're preparing your clinical trials for FDA approval. So if you have something that can be used on the general population at large, but you know it will help Medicare beneficiaries also, what does this mean? It means you need in your cohort of subjects and patients who you're going to do with your clinical trials, you need people that are 65 and older. Because if all your clinical trials focused on people that are of teenage years, and then you try and say, yes, but it's beneficial to Medicare patients, they're going to say, where is the clinical data showing that? Show me where that is. So local coverage determinations. We can talk about, in terms of local coverage determinations, is it reasonable and necessary? We've talked about that already. It's limited to the jurisdiction of that Medicare contractor. Usually they have several states. You submit basically before you get a coverage determination, or even if you have no code, because that's often what's happening. It's so new, you don't have a specific code, you don't have a coverage determination, and so there are some catch-all codes for different types of things, and you submit it in a catch-all code, and instead of filing it electronically and it just paying out, they'll ask for additional medical information and justification, and then they determine at a local level what the reimbursement rate is. And once you have a substantial number of those, you start to talk about, okay, I need a code, okay, I need coverage, okay, I need a set payment. And it all sort of wraps around. If you can see, my talking points are very circular because the coding, coverage, and payment, although I show it as linear on the slides, first you get the code, then you get the coverage, then you get the payment. While I could talk about it that way, as you hear as I go through, it's more like a spiral. You keep intersecting with all of the parts. Local coverage determinations, you know, what you do is you go and you talk to the contractor's medical director and you explain your new technology. You ask for a meeting. You sit down and you say, here's my new technology. You show them the new gizmo. You tell them why it's important for Medicare beneficiaries. You tell them why it's different from anything else, why it will improve the health, and what data you have to back that up. You talk about the cost of creating the product, how much it will cost to sell the product, and hopefully you get a good local coverage determination. If a contractor decides that there is no local coverage determination, or rather that they're not going to cover the device, any individual beneficiary can actually appeal that determination in their particular medical case, and it can be overruled. So a negative LCD can be overruled by an administrative law judge. And so that's helpful. When you do national coverage determinations, it applies to all Medicare contractors. There's no local contractor discretion. They must follow the national coverage determination. And such national coverage determinations, they can either be initiated internally by CMS or on request. And oftentimes, kind of like Supreme Court rulings where they have different circuits with different opinions, if you have lots of local coverage determinations that go different ways, that may be a good time to seek a national coverage determination for CMS to make an ultimate decision. But as you'll see, some coverage considerations that you might have. If you are thinking, as I just said, you have local contractors and you have local coverage determinations going more than one direction. Is that better or worse? That means in some jurisdictions it will be covered and some it's not. If you go to a national coverage determination, you have to be confident that CMS nationally is going to cover everywhere, because if they decide to make a non-coverage determination, then you've lost out on the local coverage determinations that already had approved your product. So you want to be talking to CMS on national coverage determinations and sort of getting their pulse. You want to be talking to the contractors if you're trying to get a local coverage determination. If you are doing the local coverage determination route, some considerations. First of all, it's going to be a more, I don't know if it's really more time intensive, but certainly you're going to have more balls in the air because you're going to have to talk to several contractors, not just one CMS. You'll want to see, how do you do that? I mean, there's, you know, over a dozen contractors. How do you pick which one? Well, where are you going to try and market first? Where have you in your business plan decided the best place is to go and try and sell your product? Where are more Medicare beneficiaries where you're trying to sell the product? And pick, you know, a couple markets at a time to try and roll it out. And that's how you'd pick where the contractors. You might look at other coverage determinations from that contractor, see how they handle coverage determinations. Where are they making coverage determinations that are favorable? Where are they doing that they're not favorable? They're all on CMS's website. So you want to look into that and make very strategic determinations of where you would want to get a local coverage determination. Let's move to reimbursement considerations for just a couple minutes here. So when you're getting your FDA approval, going back to the beginning again, consider the payment implications. Your FDA approval may limit the type of coverage CMS will provide, which gets you to how much the payment will be. For example, if you're seeking a 510K, that could dictate your coding and payment category. If your 510K gets you into a coverage category that's already got a CPT code, that's already got payment, that's likely to be your pathway too. Is that a good pathway? You should know that when you're seeking your FDA approval. Next reimbursement consideration, and Steve touched on this, who is the target purchaser? We have very different reimbursement schemes here in the United States depending on who the purchaser is. Is it a hospital? Is it inpatient or outpatient? Is it a physician office? Is it for a patient to use in their home? All of those things will determine how the reimbursement is driven. And while you're thinking about who is the purchaser, always in the back of your mind, understand if the hospital, for example, is the purchaser, you have a new technology that's a big piece of capital equipment, the hospital ultimately will have to decide whether to buy it, but for them to want to buy it, they need doctors telling them, I want this new product, this is what this new product is going to do for me. So you're selling to physicians because they're the ones that are going to be ordering the product, using the product, but you also have to obviously get the hospital's buy-in that it's worthwhile for them to have the product. So just quick reimbursement primer. For hospital inpatient reimbursement, there are diagnostic-related groups. That's how everybody's paid. It's a prospective payment system. If you have a hip implant, you get X number of dollars. Doesn't matter how long you stay in the hospital. Doesn't matter what they do to you in the hospital. You get a bundled payment rate for hips. Now, it's more nuanced than that. There's hips with this or with that. So it's not hips overall, but generally speaking, patients who have the same kind of diagnosis will get the same payment rate. There are new technology add-ons. When you show substantial clinical improvement, the current DRG for the condition wouldn't be adequate. So if you have a diagnostic group and that DRG is not adequate once you put the new technology in and there's no data, look at the next bullet point, to include the cost in the DRG, those data aren't available to how to raise the DRG. There may be a new technology add-on that you could take advantage of in the hospital. But recognize again the key here that it's a bundled payment. So anything you add to the bundle, if you don't have a new technology add-on, will be money out of the pockets of the hospital. They're going to have to spend more. So obviously you're going to have to make sure that how is it worth their while if there's not a new technology add-on. For hospital outpatient, it's similar. They have these things called APC, ambulatory payment classifications. It's not just one per outpatient, but they do bundle things that happen together. If you get a whole bunch of tests for a condition, and you always do these 3 tests. They bundle them into one APC, and that's your payment. There are transitional pass-through payments for drugs, biologics, and devices, or you can create a new APC category for new devices. Again, you have to show substantial clinical improvement over current treatments, and it's a 2-year transition, but no more than 3 years. I just want to quickly mention clinical trials for Medicare NCDs. Medicare covers the routine costs of qualifying clinical trials. So if you're using a device in a clinical trial, you can get the routine costs paid for. It doesn't include the investigational device or the procedure itself, but it includes the routine things that would happen. So if you're implanting something and there's a surgery to implant it, the surgery would be covered. If there's blood tests that you need to take to make sure the patient is doing well, those will be covered. Any complications, complications that arise that you then need medical treatment for, all of that is covered by Medicare. Physician reimbursement. So moving away from the hospital and to the physician reimbursement, there's 2 ways that physicians can be impacted by reimbursement decisions. The first way is you've got a technology in the hospital, but you got a physician who's using the technology. If the technology is going to take the physician more time, the patient is going to get about the same outcome, and yet the physician's going to get the same payment rate, because while the hospital gets a payment rate for the facility and all the technology, the physician is getting a payment rate for their professional services. Both of those payments are made for the hospital patient. If the physician is taking more time to do something, but his payment rate is the same, you have to ask yourself, what is the likelihood that the physician is actually going to want to use the new technology? So while you're looking for the payment rate for the hospital to get the procedure covered on the hospital side and part of the DRG, you also want to be looking on the physician side. Is this a new enough procedure that the physician should get a new CPT code with greater dollars attached to it? And so you want to look at that. The other way physicians are impacted is if it's a physician service in his or her own office. How are you going to deal with that? Those are usually CPT codes on what's called the physician fee schedule for CMS, and that's a whole different reimbursement structure that you'll have to work through in the same way. There's no pass-through costs, but you want to see what does the code get if you're using a current code, or if you get a new code, what are you likely to get as reimbursement? And here's the last slide about that. If it's technology in the office, if it's a diagnostic service, there's usually a technical component to that that would include the device cost. For a therapeutic, there's a place of service code differential that would include all of the overhead. That overhead includes the device, but what you need to think about is how is that device really going to get captured. Lastly, just a note that if a physician isn't doing the procedure or the service him or herself, like a lab test, big lab develops this new test, but the lab test is done in a big lab somewhere else, and what you would like to do is say, physician, you buy the lab test, we'll do it for you, and you bill the payer. Medicare doesn't allow that. Commercial payers more and more aren't allowing that, and some states don't allow that. So you want to look at what limitations there are on who can do the service and who can bill for the service. And lastly, how are you going to market? Just a shout out to beware of the fraud and abuse laws. There's an anti-kickback statute that says you cannot pay physicians for ordering your test or referring your test, so you want to be careful about that. And in terms of Stark, that's a self-referral law that's very complicated. You should just know that there's only certain things in certain categories that physicians can refer to themselves when they have it in their office, and they have to abide by certain rules as well. So you want to think about those things when trying to figure out how do you want to classify for the FDA, how do you want to classify things for codes, for coverage, and for reimbursement. And Jen, with that, I will turn it back to you.
sorry. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Julie has to leave very soon, so does anyone have a quick question for her? If not, we'll move on to questions for Steve. Okay, Julie, thanks so much. And Yoav, I believe you have a question for Steve.
Thank you all. If you do have further questions, I know my information is on the slides. I'd be happy to talk to anyone offline. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yes, hi, this is Yoav. I wanted to ask Steve about the FDA fast track. What does it take to enter this track, and what is the schedule for getting an approval on that track?
Sure. So there are FDA fast track procedures for drug side and device side, and they are different. On the device side, there's something called priority review, and they published a guidance. I can send that to you. It's actually very helpful. It was published May 17th, 2013, and it sets the criteria for what is a device that's appropriate for what's called priority review. So number one, does it treat a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitated disease or condition? And then it has to meet a couple more conditions. Is it a breakthrough technology, meaning it's a big advantage over what currently exists? Are there no other alternatives or inadequate alternatives? And then is the availability of the device in the best interest of patients? So that's kind of a Dropbox category. If you meet these criteria, you apply, and then you get a decision very quickly through FDA on the device side. So if your device is a 510K, that first of all, they will review your request within 2 weeks and declare whether they will consider it or not. If you are a 510K, at the end of 2 weeks, you'll have an answer, yes or no, will you get priority review. If you are a PMA, a Class 3, at the 45-day review, remember a PMA can be thousands of pages, and they have to decide if they're going to accept it in the first place, and that process has a time period of I believe it's 45 days. At 45 days, they will do an initial review and tell you yes or no to your priority review. What happens from there is a more intense review. For 510Ks, remember the deadlines, it's still pretty fast, 90 review days. But what they try to do is be more interactive instead of a stop and start where you have some questions and then there's a formal process. FDA sounds out deficiencies, then you respond and you come back. It's a little more interactive. If you get 10 questions, you can answer 10 today. Go back and forth on those while you're working on the other 8, and the goal is to decrease the time. The FDA will allocate more resources, meaning they may add extra members to the review team. They may take away other responsibilities from this review team so that they can concentrate more on your product. Same with the PMA. Remember, the PMA deadlines are 180 days. They work very hard to be more interactive to try and decrease those timelines. On the drug side, it's a little bit different, and drug reviews are more drawn out. The time periods are much, much longer. They have 4 programs called Fast Track, Breakthrough Therapy, Accelerated Approval, and Priority Review. You can find all of this on the web page, and I can send out a link. But they set criteria for what can be fast-tracked and the timeline for how you will get a decision. They set out criteria such as your drug must show superior effectiveness to what's out there or affect serious outcomes, avoid serious side effects, improve the diagnosis of a condition where early diagnosis can result in improved outcome, decreasing toxicity, and the benefits of this, if you are given this fast track, you get more frequent meetings with the FDA to discuss the development plan, more frequent written communications on the design of trials, and you're eligible for some of the other programs such as accelerated approval and priority review. So these are other programs and their conditions for breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review. And similar to the device side, more resources are allocated in terms of teams, more meetings, more interactive, and the goal is to decrease the length of time between the initial submission and eventual approval and review. So we can talk about this offline if you have more specific questions about how to review. I have some good links that I can put together, and also this guidance from FDA on the device side is really a great document. Lays it all out for you. So I would encourage you to look on there. And just in general, the FDA website can be tough to navigate, but there is really some great materials on there, particularly the guidance. And under device advice, it can really tell you how to do different things, give you formats for the applications, and also you can pick up the phone and call them.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. So thank you all so much for joining. We hope you enjoyed Steve and Julie's presentations. We here at the Maryland Israel Development Center, we do have committees of experts that include Steve and Julie and many other experts that are happy to help you with your U.S. market entry. And as Barry Bogage, our Executive Director of MIDC, mentioned in the beginning, Maryland is a great place to come and do business. The FDA is here, NIH is here, Johns Hopkins, and we have a huge bio cluster on our I-270 corridor. And here at the Maryland Israel Development Center, we are happy to provide you with business introductions. We do trade delegations, showcase networking events, webinars like this one, and if you do choose to make Maryland a place where you will have your U.S. office, we are here to provide you with what we call instant infrastructure. The last thing, just to mention again, that we are coming to Israel on May 8th to 14th for the Biomed Conference, and we would love to meet all of you and find out if there are more ways that we can be helpful. So thank you all so much. Please feel free to email any of us with additional questions, and we really thank you all for joining us, and thank you again to Steve and Julie for your great presentations.
Thanks again, everybody, and we're available offline if you want to reach out to us. And it's easy to reach the Life Science Committee through Jen or myself or Barry, and we will plug you into whatever type of needs that you have, and we're very happy to do so. So thanks again for your time.
Yeah, and Steve, in addition to being the presenter at this webinar, is a co-chair of our Life Science Committee. Great.
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.